Hi there, my name is Philip Eidson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And this week, I want to share with you a conversation from a recent AOP Live webinar with my good friends Joe Payne and Jennifer Ulrich from Corcentric. In this episode, and we titled it, Could the Great Resignation Lead to Better Procurement Talent? We looked at the talent constraints at the strategic end of the hiring market and how this may provide an opportunity to create hybrid, in-source, outsource procurement delivery models. And those of you that know me well know that this is a topic I'm really passionate about. Having previously implemented and led models like this, I've seen what works and I've seen what doesn't work. And actually, Joe, Jen, and I get into the nuts and bolts to explore how to make an in-source, outsource model work for you and some of the landmines to avoid along the way. So I started by asking Joe if he's seeing the impact on the ground of the Great Resignation.
We're seeing it everywhere. And personally, I've seen a lot of good friends and coworkers moving jobs at our customers, specifically and in particular in procurement, but not limited to procurement by any means. There's been a lot of folks that have moved positions, change jobs, change career paths. And, look, I call it the Great Reshuffling more so than the Great Resignation. And in some ways, it almost feels like we're just passing cards around. And what I mean by that is, within Corcentric, we may lose someone to one of our competitors, and then we pick someone up from the same competitor. And I see that in industry as well, where someone who was our sponsor at one customer has moved to another company, and they've traded places and moved around. And that's the reality. The reality is, look, what COVID has brought is it created an environment where location is not a factor in what you want to do with your career, right? Like, it opens up doors, a lot of doors that were previously locked. And the other piece of it is the scarcity of talent has substantially increased wages for people moving positions. And so those two factors have made people rethink things that maybe 2 years ago they just never would have rethought. So we're seeing it all the time. I'd like to say that maybe it's slowing down a little bit, but I'm really not sure it has. It might just be kind of a summer lull in hiring and recruiting. But yeah, I imagine it's going to continue for quite a while. And in this new world where the job opportunities are not regionally or locally based, it's probably going to be a few years before we see it slow down.
Do you think also it's because as we've evolved the profession and what the talent that you look for in procurement today is maybe different than what it was 5-10 years ago? And we've talked about this a lot, that there's actually the market to hire the top procurement talent is getting smaller, which is creating some of that because that's really where the demand is.
Yeah, I would say so. I think that there's a very limited capacity or limited availability of resources that are at the level that folks are looking for. Like you said, procurement has matured. I think that's going to be an ongoing topic today. It usually is when we speak, right? But the reality is, look, we know it hasn't reached its full potential yet. But if I look back 10 years, where we were still explaining to folks what best practices are for strategic sourcing, those things are kind of old hat now. And so the companies out there looking for seasoned procurement talent and really having a better idea than they did 10 years ago of what that actually means, right? Because you're not looking for someone that has 30 years of purchasing experience, so to speak, right? You're looking for something a little bit different than that. And there's just limited resources out there right now that have that type of experience.
So we're going to dig into that throughout the session today. But what I wanted to do first of all is actually share a poll, the results of a poll. So in advance of the session, Kelly ran a LinkedIn poll that asks, when your procurement team is short on headcount, how do you fill the gap? And there were some really interesting results for that. So I'm just going to read out the results for anybody who may be listening to this as the podcast afterwards. So the question again, when your procurement team is short on headcount, how do you fill the gap? The results were that 59% of respondents said that we just work harder. 17% say we accomplish less. 13% said we hire freelance contractors. And 11% of respondents said we work with consultants. I think we had around 250 responses, something like that, to this poll. So I'm going to ask you, Jen, first of all, just for an immediate reaction to those results.
Well, I'd say, first of all, it's not surprising to see these results, but that doesn't mean it's not disheartening. We think about the plight of procurement, and again, a common topic for us is how hard procurement has to work to demonstrate their value within the organization. So when you hear that as a result of the headcount shortage, they're just working harder, it really does break my heart to think about how much harder they could possibly be working than they already are. But I also realize too that behind that is the fact that not only are they working harder, they're working harder with less. So the results, the expectations on the results that have to be achieved today are much higher as a result of the pandemic and the Great Resignation. And then their ability to execute effectively I don't think it's changed as much as we'd like it to be in terms of the technology that's available, because when everybody's having to step up and take 1 or 2 or 3 roles on per person, the ability to put in place new technology and efficiency gains, I can speak from my own experience, becomes that much harder, because keeping the lights on is priority 1. Keeping them on with the right light bulbs becomes priority number 2. So it's just, it's a bit challenging. And I recall too, because I had followed this poll, and I think there were several comments around, well, you forgot about technology. What about how the digital transformation enables us? And that's my comment to that. I don't think that it's really helping things right now, because it's just another thing that gets pushed down in terms of our priorities, unfortunately.
Joe, what was your reaction to these results?
Yeah, I had 2 kind of top level thoughts on this. One is, I think that at least half of the folks who said working harder are actually just really accomplishing less, and they think that they're working harder to accomplish the same, but that's not the case. And the other thing is, I would say that the work harder and accomplish less should really be combined. They are in a sense one and the same. The reality is, working harder means you're going to be reacting more, right? You have less ability to be proactive, to think more strategically, to try to think 1 step ahead. And so you create this spiral, right, where you're reacting to situations that maybe you didn't even have to react to if you had more time to think strategically about them in the first place. And so it's kind of a downward spiral if you think that you're working harder and that's going to solve all your problems. It's just not going to do it.
No, when I think about, working harder and that spiral, that vicious circle that you can get into, and that it drives the perception of procurement. So the perception of procurement, therefore we're being reactive and we're checking boxes because that we needing to get the work off our plate because there's more work coming. Then it perpetuates that perception of we're just there to do transactions and to help process and to be tactical. So it actually gets us further away from our goal of being strategically impactful, because we're just kind of in reactive mode.
Yes, and that is a big concern that I've seen with our customer base that has been impacted by the Great Resignation or the Great Reshuffling. There is a general awareness that with less resources, their ability to continue the momentum that they've had within their organizations, both in terms of things like stakeholder engagement, but also enforcing policy, enforcing compliance. A lot of that was able to be done because they had resources that could execute on the most, from tactical to strategic, right? And without those resources, the business is going to say, well, yes, this is your policy, but if you can't fulfill your policy with resources to help me, I'm going to kind of do it my own way because my own way is easier.
Mm-hmm.
And so customers, I'm seeing it at our customers where they're very much concerned with, is the perception of procurement going to be impacted if I can't deliver the way I used to deliver?
Now, how sustainable, Jen? I'm going to bring you in for this one. How sustainable is just working harder? You know, at what point?
Yeah.
And you probably see this with your clients all the time. There gets to be a breaking point.
Right. And I was actually just going to add to that anyway, is that when you see this many people working harder, well, then you're just feeding back into the cycle of the Great Resignation because they're going to get burned out, and at some point they're going to get sick of it because they're not going to get the increases in pay that are equal to the amount of work that they're putting in, and they're going to say, you know what? It's a candidate's market. I'm going somewhere else and doing a lot less for a lot more money. So
The
it's kind
grass
of
is
just,
always greener.
yep, right. So you're just kind of reinforcing that cycle, and then also just to complement what you both were saying, what I'm seeing with our clients is they're having to pick and choose what initiatives they can work on and what not. Again, just kind of further perpetuates that challenge of, we've been trying so hard to get a seat at the table, and now we have to pick only one seat at the table versus how many we really need. It's a shame. I think there's a lot of solutions out there that you can tap into without being worried about overwhelming the team more by bringing in some help, really.
Now, are you seeing any consistency in what they're picking to prioritize?
I think it goes by complexity, right, and impact. So for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, where we know that the tech ops or technical operations space typically is very highly regarded as a key piece of the organization to keep things moving. They're the ones that are going to get a lot of the resources versus SG&A, so more of your operational spend areas, because it's kind of okay to let those contracts go a little bit longer, right, or not be as focused on. At the end of the day, we know those are the areas that very quickly over time become the most troublesome when you don't pay attention to them.
Yeah.
So it's about creating the right balance and priority and value. But again, at the end of the day, you only have so many hands to support that. But this has been a big topic of conversation in a lot of places that I've seen, not just with our customers, but, out there in the market.
Yeah, and what was interesting as well, Joe, I'll kind of pose this to you. We saw only 24% of respondents actually reaching out to work with, to bring in some extra resource to help. And, why do you think that number is I think, pretty low? Why would you say that's as low as it is?
It is low. It's not surprising at all to me that in the world of procurement, there is limited focus on leveraging third-party support. I've seen it for 20 years now. But there's two elements to it. The first is something we've talked about before. It may sound a little controversial, I don't know, but I believe procurement is really bad at investing in procurement. We've got this history and mentality of not spending money or trying to help the company spend less money. And so when it comes to investments within procurement, be it people, outsourcing, technology, training, I mean, you see it survey after survey. Procurement just does not get the money they need to improve and to really to be more strategic. But the other piece of it is, I think there's a procurement probably more so in some other areas like IT, finance. There's this old school mentality associated with outsourcing that, one, it's not the optimal way to build a procurement organization. So in other words, bringing in a third party, why would I do that? I can put my own resources in it. I can manage them better. I can be more efficient in managing them. And there is this mentality within procurement that everything, as much as possible, should be done in-house. I don't know exactly why that is, outside of my first point around not wanting to spend money. But the reality is procurement capacity and staffing needs are very much, I think, more so than a lot of other areas of the organization, fluctuating. The demand is fluctuating, right? Because even in a very mature organization where, by Q4, you've got your strategic sourcing roadmap and plan for the next year. You know what projects are going to go after. You know what you need to do to staff them. Well, all of a sudden there's an acquisition, right? Or COVID comes into play, or some other change that hits the economy or your business or whatever. And suddenly you're being asked to do a lot more than what you had planned. And so there's this fluctuating demand, yet we don't tend to look at it as, well, I can solve that problem by tapping into third-party resources. So, it's kind of a long answer, but reality is, I think it's just part of that history of procurement, kind of being gun shy around spending money on external third parties, and really the kind of the stigma within outsourcing and procurement.
And I've made a note around, because I want to come back to it. I wonder if it's because we struggle to demonstrate the value proposition of getting that additional investment. And that's not just in third-party services, that's in technology. It's in, anything that we need to, be able to invest in ourselves in learning and development. And so a lot of cases, it's like we don't even try, in my experience, because we think we're going to get a no before we even go and ask for the money. So is it that we just don't have a good story to tell, which is a bigger problem than going for investment, for external services? It strikes at the heart of what is the procurement value proposition for the companies we support.
And we always tend to default to hard dollar savings, right? And that's not, like we spoke about earlier, around the perception of procurement, the ability to drive compliance and to keep the stakeholder community engaged with the procurement process you've established. That's not about finding additional hard dollar savings. That's about just keeping what you have, right? Keeping the influence, keeping the monitoring going. And so those things are harder to quantify, but they should be quantified. I've got so many customers that still default to hard dollar savings, hard dollar new savings as the only method to generate an ROI. And, what I just described is a good example of, it goes well beyond net new hard dollar savings. Right. There's compliance savings. There's things like, revenue generation, right? If you're getting suppliers to provide you with something they're not providing to others that you can sell, there's all sorts of ways to show the value. But yeah, we tend to default to the old traditional model.
And I want to encourage anybody who is watching, has questions, please feel free to submit those questions as we continue the conversation. We'll be on the lookout for those as they come in, and bring some on screen as we go through the conversation. But actually, I want to kind of pivot towards, okay, so we need some help. We've kind of seen that a lot of folks in the community are saying that we're either doing less or we're working harder. So how do we get some help in the short term? Jen, when we look at the kind of the procurement, the sourcing, operating model, what are some of the roles that lend themselves better in your experience to actually leveraging external third-party help?
I think it's not just the entire role itself, but it's portions of the role too that can kind of be segmented. So strategic sourcing end to end is one that I think easily lends itself, as I think many of us know, in broader sense, so more generalist in terms of bringing in someone that kind of can hit on a lot of different categories, but then also very niche category expertise. Yeah. So many firms out there, right, that have very specific specialties with bringing the right expertise to the table that even outside of this environment, you may bring them in anyway for a particular need. And then there's the segmentation of the role too. And I've seen that be really successful if you have the right partnership with in the client relationship, right, where you can keep one side of it being the stakeholder facing while the external party is interfacing with other third parties, right? And again, if that works well, if you set it up the right way, you can be very successful. And I encourage that hybrid approach because I think it's important that as we're continuing to help push the value procurement, that Your internal team should be interfacing with the stakeholders, developing those relationships, being that face and name that they can count on, and then pushing the other work to an outside party, the heavy lifting with the analytics, just a lot of that logistical back and forth with the supplier, developing RFPs, refining templates, all of that I think can be easily thrown to a third party in the right support model. And I think I was thinking about this as you two were talking about the outsourcing piece, and it folds into this as well in terms of having that right partnership. Finding the right outsourcing partner is just like finding any other resource internally. You're not going to hire the first one you speak to, without having someone to compare them to. And it's more than just having the right expertise that the firm or the third party brings. It's about having the right personalities. You're going to be working with these individuals on a regular basis. You want to get along and actually like each other, like your coworkers, right? So I think so many people have hired an outside firm with the wrong criteria in mind, thinking they have expertise, but my goodness, I just can't stand working with this person. Well, I don't care how smart or great they are in a particular category if you don't want to actually work with them every day. Same goes for your coworker. So there's a lot of factors. I think the stigma that goes with outsourcing is it's from bad experiences that are very real.
Yeah, from that culture perspective, I've delivered outsourcing services as well for a part of my career and seen engagements that have succeeded and engagements that have failed. And ultimately, it comes down to culture and cultural fit. And you may, I don't want to ever advocate for missing goals or anything like that, but at the end of the day, people are going to advocate for you based on the cultural fit and where they felt that they helped you. If you have missed your goals and they don't like you, then they're going to use that against you. If you have missed targets, but they actually think that what you're doing is bringing a lot of value in other ways, then they're going to work with you, obviously, to ensure that the goals are met. But it's not going to be a finger pointing, let's bring out the contract conversation. It's more collaboration around service provision and have you got the right things in scope and have we got the right stakeholder engagement and all. And those are the kinds of conversations that you have.
Yes, definitely.
Go ahead, Joe. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of add to what you and Jennifer said, when it comes to what are the best fit roles, right? So we've talked about this before. I never advocate for full outsourcing of procurement. Procurement is a strategic function. It can create a competitive advantage when it's done properly. And so you want to have a dedicated in-house team that is the procurement organization. But where you want to think about the best spots to use a hybrid model or third party to support it. Look, what we've seen in the market with the Great Resignation is there's this tremendous need for procurement resources at all levels, from the most strategic, those are the ones you want to make sure are in-house, to what are the most operational or tactical. So for example, right now, looking at some of the job boards out there, we found that there's about 4,500 open positions for a Coupa administrator. Right? And if you add that plus all the other platforms out there, it's probably more like 15 to 20,000. Yeah. And you're going to compete for that resource, that open headcount, and you're probably going to pay double what you would in a normal environment because there's just a scarcity of resources with that experience. And the question is why, right? So think about that, and you can take it to any level. And Jennifer rightly noted, like strategic sourcing is a great example. Strategic sourcing is strategic, but it is also a process. It's a very process-oriented and structured way of going out to bid. And so from requirements build all the way through contract execution, those are things that you can, if you have standard protocols, great. There are companies that can follow. If you don't, there are companies that can bring their best practices to help you. And so there's really anything that's repeatable. And I would say where the talent gap in the marketplace is stretched thin already, those are the areas that you want to look to outsourcing.
Yeah, it's funny how, the procurement services market, and I say services rather than outsourcing for exactly the same reason as kind of the negative connotations that came with procurement outsourcing in its infancy, has gone from let's throw everything over the fence to a provider and do, multiple tower, which means, multiple categories or multiple elements, to a lot more of a surgical approach. So it's where are the gaps? Where do we need some specific help? And how can we do that as opposed to it just being everything? Now, one of the things that we had on the question was the differentiation between contractors and gig economy, like freelance, and kind of a gig approach versus a programmatic, a service-based approach. Jennifer, how would you distinguish between those two?
So I think, the contractors or gig workers, if you will, they're often sought after when you really want somebody in person, right? On site is common, even remote today, but having one person that's a point of contact for whatever that thing is, right? And what you find though is you're kind of, and I think that works on a lot of models, right? And I'd say it's probably more so when you want that in-person physical presence to be there as that point of contact, versus if you're looking for more of that virtual services model that you can kind of tap into more of a consultative or, outside firm that has more resources to leverage. But there's a lot of risks and benefits, I think, to both approach. And it really comes down to what you're looking for and what you're looking to get out of it. But ultimately, you can get a lot from one person when you have that contractor or gig worker. But I think for me personally, I don't see how it's terribly different than just bringing in a full-time resource. The amount of recruitment that you have to do and vetting, all of the due diligence you have to do to bring in, especially if you're bringing someone into your physical environment, there's extra, security elements to cover, contracting. Again, it's not that much different than having a full-time resource, and you're still having to do all of the ramp up, right? The onboarding and all of that yourself, whereas you bring in, an outside firm, they are used to doing this on a regular basis. So they have a set of processes. They make it very easy. And of course, I'm speaking from experience, but again, there's less that typically goes into, especially in the virtual environment where they're using their own tools and their own processes and layering it in with yours. But again, I think there's benefits to both approach depending on what the need is.
Mm-hmm. Now, the folks who are actually typically delivering, advisory services and procurement services, what kind of backgrounds, is the kind of the typical, I don't want to say consultant, because consultant has a negative connotation sometimes, but what are some of the backgrounds that you typically see in folks who are sourcing advisors, let's say, from a procurement services firm?
I think it's actually pretty interesting, and it's especially what we've seen as a result of the Great Resignation is it's a great area that you can pivot into from a lot of other areas. So we've seen people be very successful coming from industry, right? From procurement roles themselves, where they're just looking to take that next step in their career and say, I've learned so much in one environment. I'd love to be able to grow and work with a lot of other companies and use my knowledge. I've also seen people come from, other industries altogether, especially in the finance space, where they've worked a lot in the private equity world or mergers and acquisitions, and they can leverage the concepts there of how they've been able to bring together process and technology into an advisory role, right? So there's a lot of different ways that you can come in. I mean, we look at the historically, our consulting team here, and we have people coming from the agricultural world, from an engineering background, from a scientific background. That's what I think is, in a kind of geeky way, is so cool about procurement. It's a process that you can learn and just layer on the expertise that you already have and leverage it in a new way.
Yeah. Joe, do you find a lot of folks come from a practitioner organization into services as well?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And just kind of piggyback on Jen's point, it's not just people with procurement backgrounds coming over. It's generally people that are familiar with procurement and more familiar with like a mature, or I would say, I guess, more high functioning procurement organization. But folks that are coming from backgrounds in marketing or logistics or supply chain, very frequently will make that shift. And what's nice about it is they're able to show some really deep subject matter expertise because they've been on the other side of the fence, and speak the language of marketing or HR or whatever, and can bring that into a procurement focused environment. But there's also this idea, look, if you're in industry, you're probably tied most likely to a specific industry, right? Like once you're in pharma, you tend to stay in pharma. If you're in manufacturing, you'll stay in manufacturing. There's always moves, right? But companies are looking for people with experience in their industry. When you go into consulting, you start to get a very diverse experience across industries. And one of the things I like about that the most in working with our customers is we can bring best practices outside of a specific industry to our customers, and it's things that they've never seen before, right? Like, in manufacturing, you always do certain things one way, but in pharma or even in finance, right, there might be a completely different way to approach a given problem. And so I look when we're especially when we're hiring, I look for people who can take their knowledge in one industry and apply it into others, because that's really valuable for our customers.
Yeah, from a procurement career perspective as well as an individual, that's definitely a path I took. I started my career in automotive and decided that, as much as I love the automotive industry, I didn't want to look back in 20 years and only have had automotive, because it's really difficult to get out of that when you're in a specific industry and you're kind of at the whim of the cyclical nature of an industry. So I went completely the other side and went to pharma, which went from a mandate-driven culture to one where, they couldn't spend money fast enough.
That's right.
And procurement kind of got in the way because there was mega merger integration buckets that had to be spent. But it's great for challenging your own skill sets as well, and for being able to demonstrate that you can. It really broadens the career opportunities you have further down in your career if you're in roles that touch multiple. You have the ability to touch multiple categories. Multiple industries. I do want to bring in a couple of questions that we've got, because there's a couple of interesting questions based on the conversation we've had so far. This first one is from Dennis. Jen, I will ask this one to you first of all. I'll put you on the hot seat. How do we assess a third party's culture in the evaluation and selection process?
So I would say, the way that we do it, honestly, is individuals like myself who are going to be on the delivery side of leading accounts and engagements and heavily involved with a customer, just ask to talk to the people that are actually going to deliver. Get out of the sales people world, right? And you want to talk to the individuals. You don't have to make it a complicated interview process. Just, can you tell me, let me talk to a few of the people that I'm going to be working with on a regular basis. And that's actually, I'd say that happens a lot now, is I want to see the CVs. I want to know, who am I going to be working with? Is it going to be the same people? And are you going to constantly throw different people at me? But yeah, just have conversations with them, make it pretty casual. It doesn't have to be an overly formal process. And in fact, the more informal it is, I think, it is where you're able to really shine and show your personality and say that, do I like this person or not? And it's all about first impressions too. Like, I've had so many first conversations where, like, oh my gosh, we're not going to work well together at all. and everybody feels it, or others where you just click right from the very beginning. You're like, yep, we're going to work together. So,
yeah, I would say to add to that too, like to your point around the formality of it, there's best ways to approach that, and there's kind of more tactical ways. A lot of times I see organizations trying to get a sense of that cultural fit through the RFP process, but what it leads to is, asking a question in the RFP, like, send me the bios or the CVs of the people who are going to be dedicated to my account. And look, just think about it from the provider side, right? You're in the middle of an RFP. You don't know if you're going to win or lose it. You don't know if you need to staff for it or not. When you're in that stage of the process, you're not going to be able to get the real team. If you do, that company has too much capacity and there might be a problem there. But when you get to, down selection stage, right, and you're starting to have more meetings around, like, okay, how is this really going to work? The business operations side of it. That's where you want to start to ask for, tell me who's going to be on my account, show me who my account manager is. Can we have some workshops with them? and then ask them questions about specific challenges that you've had within your organization, right? If you've had problems with compliance or change management or getting engagement from a particular group within your organization, bring those to light with the team that you're going to be working with, and see how they would resolve those issues or help you solve those problems. That's the best way to approach it, right? Is that are these folks understanding my needs, and are they trying to adapt to my culture, to my situation and my industry, or are they just kind of bringing a static process and asking us to adapt to that?
Yeah, and there's a couple of things I wrote down here as well that you could ask them. One is, how do you hire? Because as you said, Joe,
that's a good one.
You talk about the fact you may need to staff up for a particular project if you win it. So you may not have folks on the bench that can come, and because if possible, you always want to bring folks to the the presentations and things that are going to be working on the account, but maybe you can't do it. So how do you hire? The other thing I wrote here was, how do you allocate projects? Because you can get into this phase where you've shown kind of the A team, and you talked about the expertise, but then when project allocation comes around, it may just be, well, it depends who's available and on the bench versus who's the right fit for this project.
Right.
The other thing I would say is that again, in my experience, I don't want to say the smaller the organization, but when you get away from kind of the mega companies in the space, there's more of a consideration about culture, because it has to work on both sides. Mm-hmm. When it's a much larger organization that you may be talking to, it's more around how do you fit in with their model. But you need to make sure as an employer that you're working with clients that your teams want to work with, or else it's going to continue to lead to attrition on your side too. Let's see, we have another question here that comes in from Beth, and it asks, how can we ensure that advocating for external help does not suggest that procurement has a skills shortage internally? Joe, I'm going to throw that one as a first attempt to you.
Well, I hate to kind of argue with the question, but I would say that if you're looking for external help, you probably have some sort of shortage, right? It might be a capacity issue, it might be a skills issue, and that's okay. It's okay to have those issues and to recognize it. And part of the value proposition of a third party is that they can help you fill the gaps. Mm-hmm. Because again, kind of going back to that idea that procurement always wants to have everything in-house. Think about, in a standard company, telecommunications costs, right? They could be pretty exorbitant. But those contracts come to term once every 3 years. Do you need a telecommunications expert to source that category effectively? Or do you just want to tap into a third party that can come in every 3 years, has seen what is going on in the market those 3 years, understands price models, understands changes in the market, new entrants, folks who have exited, have seen the new pricing models, have seen contract structures, tap into them for a limited period of time, get the value that you need, and then move on. In a real world business case, that variable versus fixed cost model, third party versus in-house, to a CFO, that's going to be a no-brainer, right? Like, do you need an internal resource to do all this work, or a third party that can do it in a shorter amount of time and then goes away from a cost perspective? They're always looking for those variables. So I would suggest you do want to show that there's a skills shortage, and what you're asking for is to do more than what you're able to do in-house. And then to be able to tap into that resource on an as-needed basis. And the last thing I would mention there is part of that business case or that conversation could be the best companies, the best third parties are going to help you fill the skills gap for the future, right? So if you need an outsourcer for a project or a set of projects, and you can find one that will also kind of show your team how they did it so that you can then replicate it in the future, that's a good and compelling piece of the business case, which is we need someone now, and next time we think we can do it on our own.
Yeah. That's a really important part, is the knowledge transfer, sometimes missed in the business case for like the best third parties that you work with will come in recognizing that ultimately they want you to be better at doing this. If they can help you, yes, there's I think that when I look at that question, I look at it in two ways. One is that, having skill shortages is more really related to transformation as opposed to, kind of ongoing managed services.
Right.
Ongoing managed services, as you say, is about identifying and managing gaps that you have because you just don't have the scale to be able to do everything. Whereas the skill shortages is probably more when you're making a business case for transformation. Jennifer, any kind of comments or reactions to
yeah.
Well,
and actually, I was just going to piggyback off what you just said, because I think that's a really good point too. And where I've seen at least our engagements be most successful is when we can evolve together. So where we may be brought in initially to be the sourcing team when there is no sourcing team or no procurement function, but we're there to partner and be that trusted advisor to the individual that's looking to build procurement in their organization. And you can grow with them over time and evolve your relationship to, from being that front end and doing everything to slowly stepping back and letting the category management team come in and start to develop the relationships, helping write the policies and procedures, and then they're carrying it forward. And then over time, again, continuing to shift where you become more of that back end support, and then slowly move into more of a tactical managed services component where you're just taking in, the 3 bid and a buy and taking off all of the tactical or transitional work from the strategic team. To me, the value proposition there is just incredible, right? And probably pretty unique to find an organization that can do that and not be pushing for that next big thing every 6 months, right? Like, adapt to that client's culture and work with them in the right amount of time at the right pace. But to your point, that's transformation. That's not outsourcing. That's, growing together. And my goal is always teach them to fish, right? Ultimately, they're going to be fishing on their own someday. So let's make sure that they're enabled to do that. And most of the clients that see that that's really your goal is to make sure that they're enabled with the right tools and empowered, then they're going to appreciate that more than just, I'll throw more resources and more bills at you.
Yeah, the worst thing that you see is the end of an engagement where you leave because of, maybe the business case has changed or for whatever reason, and they're basically left in the same situation as they were when you started. And that's kind of a miss on everybody, on those occasions when it does happen. We have a question from Joanna, which is, what if we hire based on the culture relationship with an advisory firm? So we like the advisory firm we work with, but from a culture perspective, but it just doesn't click with the consultant. How do you manage those situations? And Jen, I'll ask you that one first.
Yeah, it happens all the time, right? You can't get along with everybody. There might be a clash. We have different communication styles, different management styles. I think hopefully in that type of a scenario, you'll have a good relationship with someone at the sponsorship level, executive level. I mean, at least I know from our experience, we have multiple layers within the account management structure so that, if you're not comfortable maybe talking to your project manager, that you can go to the sponsor. And if you're not comfortable with them, you can go to the executive, right? There should be someone that you developed a good relationship with and a good rapport that you can say, hey, look, I love working with you guys. It's just not working with this particular person. And there's lots of ways that hopefully if the firm can recognize that and be flexible with it and say, hey, look, I can provide another resource in the front end. This person's probably going to have to be on the back end from a subject matter expertise standpoint, but we can rework the model in a way that adapts to your needs in whatever way. And we've done that so many times. So many times we've had to kind of work around and shift different roles and responsibilities to make it work. And you can't get offended by that stuff, right? It's just, we're human beings and not everybody gets along.
And I would add to that to do it early. The worst thing that happens is when there's that disconnect for whatever reason with personalities, and it's left, and then you get to a point where you point past the point of no return, and it comes into a really big problem because everybody kind of wants to work on it, but you can't fix what you don't know is broken.
Yep. That's transparency is so critical. And if you don't feel like you can be honest with your provider, then there's probably an inherent issue right there.
Yeah.
I think that's really, I'm sorry, go ahead, Phil.
No, please.
I was going to say, I think that's really a critical component of the model is the flexibility and the adaptability of a managed service. So if you think about making sure that when you're contracting with a provider, you're going through what are my escalation points, right? How do I get to, as Jen was mentioning, if you don't want to say it to that person or to your account manager? How do you get up to the level that you are more comfortable with having that dialogue? And then, the reality is that is one of the major differences between tapping into a managed service versus a contractor or a single individual, right? Because you can't if you hire a single individual and you do all the vetting, you see the resume, it looks great, you have conversations, they sound great. And then we've probably all experienced it either with a for hire employee or a third or a contractor. They show up and it's just not what you expected.
Yeah.
If you find that with an individual, you then have to start over from square one, right? And you might have lost 2, 3, 4 months in the process. If you're using a managed service, that transition period could happen in days or maybe a week or two, right? But it fixes the problem. So that's an important distinction, is that individuals are really only as good as the individual versus a third party. You can tap into multiple resources to make sure you get what you want.
Now we started the conversation talking about the Great Resignation. I want to kind of, with that in mind, but also thinking about the economic situation that we're in right now, from a business case perspective, does the times that we're in change the ability that you see of your clients or prospects to get business case approval for managed services, for example, versus FTEs? Like, do you see money going in towards like the cycle essentially of, well, we can hire contractors or external support partners, or we can hire FTEs, and how that may change because of the macro conditions? Anything you're seeing, Joe, or that you've seen, in previous cycles?
Yeah, so there's a couple elements to that. One, I kind of mentioned before, that concept of fixed versus variable costs, especially as we see inflation going up, interest rates going up, and the anticipated impact on the economy. CFOs are going to want to shift as much fixed cost to variable as possible. And so in making a business case, being able to show that you're able to do what you plan to do or intend to do as procurement at the ROI that you're going to present, and do it with resources that aren't going to be forever resources, that's going to be very motivating to a CFO. But Phil, you mentioned another great point, which is the cyclical nature of it, and the reality is we have seen every few years you kind of go from full outsourcing to no outsourcing in procurement. It kind of loops around. Like, if it's in-house, we need to outsource. If it's outsourced, we need to in-house it. And I think that as procurement has matured over the last 10 years, that we've gotten a better handle on that idea of a hybrid model. It's never a great idea to do fully one or the other. It needs to be somewhere in between. But I think that it still will have cyclical nature in terms of when you see more of a push to move some element of resources to outsourced versus the tendency to keep more or much more of it than you normally would in-house. And so to round that out, I would say just keep in mind that it will always be cyclical based on essentially economic conditions more than anything, but that hybridization, I think, is going to be a go forward state, much more so than 5 or 10 years ago.
And that was a question asked by Paul actually in advance. So thank you, Paul, for asking around kind of the models and the trends around procurement services. We had a couple of questions that we got in advance, and also a couple that we've got today actually during the conversation. But I'll kind of credit Zahara and Ricardo, who asked in advance, how can procurement make our positions stickier and reduce staff turnover? So Jen, any thoughts from a career or a personal perspective on how do we kind of cement our relevance, if you will, to the stakeholders that we support?
So I think it's about creating the right balance in terms of the workload. So we go all the way back to the beginning of the conversation today, and if the procurement team is burning themselves out and stretching themselves too thin, they're not able to really deliver the value to their different stakeholders. So if you have enough resources, you're balancing it correctly, they're going to drive that value. But ultimately, from an employer's perspective, it's important to pay attention to those things and be very mindful that the people you have working for you are more important than hitting every single goal or every milestone or whatnot. Because when you burn out those individuals, like I said before, they're going to leave, and it's a lot harder to replace them and bring somebody in and train them and start all over than it is to simply find a different solution or strategy to hit that goal. So I just think it's really critical to be very people first in the way that you're approaching this, whether you're outsourcing or insourcing, whatever the case is pay attention to the human beings that are working for you, and don't let them just burn out or be taken advantage of. So that's kind of my perspective as I work with my team in particular, but also what I see with my customers is that the ones that are most successful are the ones that are paying attention to that burnout and putting in place a lot of employee engagement, retention strategies so that they feel valued and worthy. Because when you show up to work and you like what you're doing, it's going to show in how you deliver value to your stakeholders.
And there's a question that we got as well that I'm going to bring on screen from Sammy. I'm going to ask this one to you, Joe. Is the Great Resignation an opportunity for those of us who stay in traditional procurement roles to negotiate better pay and benefits?
Yes. But I would caveat that with only if you really feel that you are a superb and phenomenal resource, pushing that down the road, and maybe if you're considered a C player or a B player, that might just open up a path to unemployment. But for the top candidates, look, if you go out in the market today and just kind of test where your salary is versus what's out there, and you haven't done that in the last 2.5, 3 years, you're looking at potentially 20-30% differences, plus benefits that have improved in the last few years. So for our top-notch talent, I would say now is a great time. I would test the market. I would just look out there and see what you see for similar roles, salaries being, and that should be your target.
And so you see the salary gap widening between an A player and a B player, for example. Like, the BC players are probably not going to see the benefits of those increases particularly, or it may be short term, but there may be some structural change to the procurement talent market which drives a bigger gap between an A and a B player.
Yeah, I would say so, especially if you're looking to negotiate internally and not make a change, right? Then your organization is naturally going to expect to get some more value from you for an increase in salary. And if you don't have the capabilities to come up to that challenge, then it's going to be short-lived, to your point, where you get the salary increase and a few months later, you're having discussions about your job performance. But outside of that, if you are capable and you're doing a good job and you think you can advance your career, now is a very good time to start having that dialogue.
Now,
I would just add to that real quick, just super
please,
quick
Jen.
there, that
Sorry.
just like we were talking about before in terms of building a business case to get an outside provider in, make sure you have a good business case, like Joe's saying.
Yes.
Don't come to the table and say everybody else is getting paid more, so I should get paid more. Yeah, no, that's not going to help you. Just make sure that whatever you're asking for, you can deliver the value in return, basically.
And it's tough for companies to break their wage structure. It's always it's always deeply rooted in internal politics and pay structures and lots of different reasons why sometimes you got to move on to get the value that that your talents deserve. So there's never you never go into those conversations with the expectation that you're going to come out with what you want, unfortunately, because your boss may have constraints of their own that they have to work within.
Right. And the grass is not always greener. I think that's what a lot of people have learned in the Great Resignation is it looks really cool over there, and they go over there. Well, this isn't any different than what I was dealing with, but now I have to learn a whole new organization and culture. So pause and really reflect before you decide to make that jump, and make sure that it's really worth it, right, in the long run.
I've been there and done that for sure, and regretted the decision. That's early in my career, I did that a few times, and led to me being in one organization 6 months, and it didn't take, very many weeks to realize that this was the wrong place, and I just went for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, if I think about from the top of the conversation, where we talk about the coworkers and friends that I've seen leave, it is probably 50-50, those who have left and felt that it was a good decision versus bad. I'm not talking about just folks who left Corcentric, but just folks that I know in the industry. I would just, kind of recommend to folks that if you are considering those changes, and part of the reason is because you're unhappy with something within your current environment, don't think that those things within your current environment aren't changeable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
If you think that there's a future within that organization, look to change the things that you don't like. Work with your leadership, work with the parties that are impacting that, and see before you make a jump if you can make a change, because it could be better for you and it could be better for the company as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, I've only got a couple of minutes here, so I'm going to sneak in one last question. Joe, I'll just pose this one to you. That Jennifer mentioned on-site versus virtual right at the very beginning. Should we determine our preference on that before we decide how to fill our talent gaps?
Yes. Yeah, you have to. But I would also say this is another one of those things that I think procurement people naturally default, even in this post-COVID or where we are in COVID world environment, that everyone needs to be on site. And we've learned that it doesn't have to be that way. We've learned that we can get the right level of engagement or the necessary level of engagement without it. And so that on-site model, I think, has some advantages, but only for key resources. And think about what those resources are if you have an on-site mentality and an on-site culture, and consider not being fixated on that for the ones where it isn't absolutely necessary, because it opens up broader sets of talent, right? Yeah. Looking at things from across the country, or like we've got folks today on our team, they're Americans, but they're living abroad, right? And I could have never done that post-COVID, have someone living in Egypt that's working on projects for U.S. customers. It's a U.S.-based resource, but they're living in Egypt right now. And so it just opens up so much more talent if you can get away from the on-site model, but it's not something obviously you can do for every position.
Well, we're at the end of our time, unfortunately now. So I want to thank you, Joe. Thank you, Jennifer, so much for the conversation. I know that we can talk operating models for a long time, and we often do, because it's something that we're all kind of passionate on, the ability to really think about how do you use internal and external in a way that really helps you drive more impact for your business. And it's not necessarily in the old school lift and shift models that that a lot of folks may still have a perception around what procurement services and procurement outsourcing is about. So before I do wrap up, I just want to thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Joe, for joining us today, and thank all our audience for being with us as well. If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.